Chinese Premier Li Keqiang met his Russian counterpart, Prime Minister Medvedev, in Moscow recently for their annual bilateral talks. How can China and Russia forge closer ties? And as the established world order begins to fracture, what role will China and Russia play? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Lukin. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang wrapped up his three-day visit to Moscow on Wednesday after meeting with Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. This was the first encounter between the two prime ministers since bilateral relations were declared to have entered a new era in June this year. So what has been achieved through such high-level exchanges? How do the countries set aside their differences to achieve common goals? And what role do China and Russia play in shaping the changing world order? I'm joined from Moscow by Professor Alexander Lukin, head of the Department of International Relations at the National Research University Higher School of Economics, and in the Beijing studio by Dr. Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, a think tank based in Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Now, the annual prime ministerial meeting mechanism between China and Russia was established in 1996 and is now in its 24th year. Professor Lukin, what would you say about the effectiveness of such a mechanism? What kind of effect has it produced on propelling bilateral ties forward?
It's a mechanism, as you said, which was established in 1996 of annual meetings of prime ministers. We have a whole entire mechanism of bilateral relations and strategic partnership beginning from annual meetings of our leaders, and the second level, I would say, is the prime ministers. So the task of prime ministers mainly is to discuss issues of economic cooperation. Presidents usually discuss more like geopolitical and political issues. So, and prime ministers also preside usually over the meeting of the so-called committee for the preparation. It's a bilateral intergovernmental committee for the preparation of meetings of the prime ministers, which has about 20 subcommittees which oversee the various specific areas of economic cooperation. So they would mostly discuss usually discuss economic issues.
Mm-hmm. How effective? Let me go to Dr. Gao here in the studio. How effective do you think these kind of mechanisms have been, especially in the case of China and Russia? People with experience to sit in official meetings oftentimes would describe the meetings as being largely following a certain protocol. You speak, he speak, I speak, and after that, hi, bye-bye, some documents signed. But effectively, has anything concrete come out of at least these mechanisms between China and Russia?
I would say China-Russian relations are very comprehensive and will take on more dimensions going forward. The prime ministerial meetings are very, very important because they really spearhead all the task forces and focus on different specific projects, etc., which will really give more meat to the overall framework of geopolitical and political cooperations between these two great countries.
Yeah, back in 2011, China and Russia set the goal of increasing trade volume to $100 billion by 2015 and $200 billion by 2020. They only reached the $100 billion mark last year, which was already a record high. And very much worthy to mention is that Russian exports to China increased by over 40% last year. Now, Russia has a trade surplus with China, and the trade surplus increased by over 1.5 times year on year. So, and that trend is continuing. During the first half of this year, bilateral trade also increased by 5%. So, Professor Lukin, what have contributed to such remarkable improvement in bilateral ties, especially from the Russian to the Chinese side?
China is by far the most important country for Russia. It's the first trading partner. As you said, the trade volume grew to $100 billion, which is, as I said, first #1 country for Russia, if you count countries, not the European Union as a whole. Trade is growing. Of course, some people say that that's not enough, but it's never enough, of course. But comparing to China-US trade, which is going down, for example, comparing to China's trade with, say, Japan or South Korea, this is a bit less, but nevertheless, Russian economy is also much smaller than the United States economy or Japanese economy, so this is understandable. The most important thing is not figures, but the fact that China satisfies a lot of demand of Russia's customers on all kinds of goods. And it's also a big market for Russian, especially raw materials, but now it's not only raw materials, but also some agricultural products.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
yeah, it's very interesting.
The fact that the United States applies sanctions, yes, as I said, and tariffs,
let me say a little bit more
on both of our countries, this also helps.
Let me say a little bit more about this 40% increase of Russian exports to China. I think that is particularly worth noting. And Dr. Lukin, what do you think has been behind such a surge? Is it because of the trade war? Is it because of US sanctions on Russia? Or is it because of the huge push, the huge let's say facilitation that the two countries have put in place to boost bilateral trade? Is such increase sustainable?
Well, there are two factors. One is that we're just big neighbors and it's natural for us to improve trade situation. But second is, of course, the factor, the US and Western, but mainly the United States policy. Because before, I would say for Russia it was 2014, before a serious crisis with relations with the West in Russia. And before, say, like 2 years ago, when President Trump began trade war against China, both markets, Russian and Chinese, were very much Western oriented. In the case of Russia, it's mostly to Europe. In China, it's mostly to the United States. But after the US government and Western governments began to use to sacrifice, I would say, their political interests to their political interests, how they understand them, both in Russia and China came understanding that they should reorient to other markets, because the Western markets are not that stable.
I see.
So China kind of reorients it's not only to Russia but to other Asian countries, to Africa, to Latin America. Russia is just part of it. For Russia it's the same.
Okay.
And it's even more China is even more important as first trading partner.
Sure. So Dr. Gao, let me come back to you. What is your understanding of the situation now? China and Russia both trying to orient away from Western oriented trade, and how do you look at this trend, 40% increase? Is that sustainable?
Well, first of all, the more trade between China and Russia, the better for China and Russia. Secondly, China economy and Russia economy are highly complementary to each other, and it's only too logical and too natural for the bilateral trade to further increase. Thirdly, I think there is a lot of political background to the great improvements and increase of China-Russian trade. Namely, as the Russian panelist just now correctly pointed out, we are both faced with increasing pressure from the Western countries in general for Russia and from the United States, abrasiveness and the unilateralism against China in particular. So I think we have both challenges, and given the dramatic improvement of political relations between China and Russia, we are only expecting that the bilateral trade will be further increased. And given the highly complementary nature of their economies, this improvement of trade will definitely bring great benefits for the Chinese nation and the Russian nation, but also it will further improve the incentive for greater political and military cooperation between the two countries.
Well, you talk about political and military cooperation between the two sides. Is that going to create more reasons for the West to worry about China and then reinforce their position currently on China, which is a very much hardened one, and on Russia? Dr. Gao?
No, I don't think so. First of all, I think China is very much defensive in nature, and Russia is being isolated, and still there are lots of international sanctions by Western countries against Russia. So China and Russia sympathize with each other and support each other politically. And their closing the rank and improving the cooperation, including in the defense sector, including lots of joint military exercises, are again for defense purposes only. It's not a threat to any other country or any Western country. And I would say going forward, these two countries, China and Russia, will need to improve their mutual understanding, improve their strategic trust of each other, and will conduct many more cooperations going forward in the military defense sector.
Okay, let me go back to the trade part, because I was not done with it, and there is a lot more to talk about. But I do want to get Professor Lukin's perspective, for instance, on what has been the sectors that have seen rapid development of bilateral cooperation, for instance, agriculture, finance, sci-tech innovation, and cross-border e-commerce. Talk to us a bit about why these sectors are particularly lucrative for bilateral cooperation, and looking forward, what kind of potentials are we looking at, from at least for the Russian side?
Well, there are several areas where we can cooperate more. For example, you mentioned financial sector. Part of sanctions against Russia are against its financial sector, against banks. Russian banks are not allowed to get long-term American credits. So China could substitute at least partially here the United States banks. But the problem here is also the use of the dollar. So Russia and China are trying to de-dollarize economy, as they say. That is, to use more of their own currencies, Chinese yuan or Russian ruble, or even European currency, the euro, instead to substitute dollar. And if they succeed to do that, then they can cooperate more in financial sector. So agriculture, as you also said, some of the sanctions and also Chinese countermeasures in the trade war with the United States is that China refuses to buy some of American agricultural products, like soybeans. Russia cannot substitute in this area the United States 100%, but it can substitute partially. And China can buy more soybeans from Russia, but if it invests in Russian soybeans production in the Russian Far East, which is very close, and the weather is there quite good for soya production, then it could be more and more in the future. So there are many factors and areas like that.
Exactly as you said, Professor Lukin. Now, in the first 5 months of 2019, Chinese companies imported 4,400 tons of Russian soybeans. So let me go to Dr. Gao here. how much is the trade war benefiting China's trade with other countries such as Russia? But eventually, if there is a trade deal, whether a long-term one or an interim one between China and the United States, are we going to say trade volume decrease again between China and Russia on soybeans, for instance?
Well, first of all, China is strongly against a trade war or tariff war launched by the United States, and China does not want to engage in trade war or tariff war. And the trade war or the tariff war are single-handedly imposed on China by the United States, and China has no other option but to fight back, to retaliate against such trade protectionist and very unequal and abrasive trade policies. Secondly, I hope the trade war will be behind us between China and the United States, so that the Chinese people and the American people can really do normal trade with each other for their mutual benefit. However, I would say this kind of hostility demonstrated by the US government against China probably will not be short-term. It probably will last for the medium term or even longer term. So China has no other choice but to strategically position itself and to diversify its imports, especially of such important goods like agricultural goods, because we cannot be exposed to a situation where certain big supply can turn on or turn off its export to China as tapping water. Because you are talking about millions of people in China depending on such imported goods, and the discontinuation or the stop or the decrease in China's import of such agricultural goods, first of all, is not good for the Chinese people, but also it's not good for the American people. So I would urge the Chinese people and the American people to unite against a trade war. And I think the United States government is doing the wrong thing for their own people, and they are misleading the world by doing this kind of trade war or tariff war. But if the side effect is China, Russia improve and increase their agricultural cooperation, that's good news for China and Russia.
Okay, so should the Chinese people and the Russian people unite in bringing up their trade volume with each other? Professor Lukin, how do you look at the kind of opportunity that's actually emerging because of this hostility between the West and Russia, and between the West and China?
Well, as my colleague rightly said, nobody wants, neither Russia nor China want to be engaged in in any kind of hostilities with the United States or Europe or the West in general. But if we have no other choice, we have to take appropriate measures. And if the side effect of this hostility is our growing trade volume, this is very good for us, and we should thank our partners for stimulating it. But of course we should develop our relations, including trade relations, regardless to this unnatural situation. And even if we improve relations somehow with the West, we should still develop our bilateral ties and bilateral trade, which is good for the peoples of both countries.
On that point, I really do want to press both guests a bit more, because just now, for instance, Dr. Gao, you mentioned mutual trust, right, including increasing mutual trust between China and Russia. Indeed, between China and Russia, it's not monolithic. We have differences. We have even a certain level of political mistrust as well, because there are areas where we see our interests potentially clash, for instance, in Central Asia, where, you know, Russia has a very traditional stronghold of influence, where China is also expanding its economic connectivity projects. So what can be done to reining those differences so that the peoples of Russia and China can indeed unite and serve their own well-being, as well as the well-being of people in other parts of the world?
Well, for two great and big countries like China and Russia to have a certain kind of differences is only natural and logical. You cannot really expect two big countries like China and Russia to think alike and do alike in everything they are engaged in. However, I would say the differences, if any, between these two countries are decreasing in number as well as in magnitude, and hopefully eventually in the years coming along we will have as little differences as possible. Why?
What is the point that Russia and China mainly differ on, for instance? Dr.
Well, I would say Russia in general still is a European-oriented country, and China is very much an Asian-Pacific country. And we have different histories, for example. We have different aspirations in sometimes. But I don't think these differences are separating China and Russia apart. If we handle these differences correctly, even though we do not need to overcome all the differences, I think these two countries are getting closer, because closer cooperations between China and Russia is in their own fundamental interest. Both the Chinese and the Russians are going to benefit from closer relations with each other, especially when the United States or the Western countries are becoming increasingly hostile to China on the one hand and against Russia on the other hand. We need to close ranks, and we need to improve our trust and confidence in each other so that we can face the hostilities from the United States or from the West world in general more cleverly and more smartly and for our own benefit.
Yeah, Professor Lukin, from the Russian perspective, from your interaction with your Russian counterparts, what is the biggest point of worry or concern that they have towards the Chinese on the business level or on the political level?
Frankly, I don't see any differences between Russia and China in the political area and in Central Asia, for example. We both, Russia and China, support the secular governments there, the economic development, political stability, and of course China's influence is growing in this traditional sphere area of Russian interests, but you know, reasonable people understand that it's a natural process. And by the way, China's influence for Russia is much more preferable here than, say, influence of the United States, who can organize or originate political disturbances here like they did in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan and in some other countries. China, of course, would never do it, so Russia has nothing against China's influence here. Of course, there can be some competition or differences between individual companies, but this is this cannot be a reason for any political differences between the two countries. Of course, we have some problems in the development of trade, for example, and investment. This is, I would say, Russian investment climate needs to be better, and the Russian government is trying to solve this problem. China also has some tariff policy, some specific measures which some Russian businessmen don't like and criticize, but these are all technical issues or minor issues which can be solved. You know, for example, if political relations between neighboring countries are good, everything else can be solved.
Indeed. Let's talk a little bit about on the global governance side of the Russian-Chinese relationship. Now, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs Liu Keqiang, in his briefing to journalists prior to Premier Li Keqiang's visit, he talked about Russia and China contributing to world affairs Chinese and Russian wisdoms, and send out Chinese and Russian voices. So let me ask Dr. Gao here. We all know the kind of Chinese wisdom, or we have already talked quite a bit about it. What do you think is the Russian wisdom, and how these two align with each other in order to contribute to the building of a world order that is more equitable?
Russians right now are a force for peace and stability in the world. They are not out there for aggression or imposing their value systems onto any other countries. And China is similarly situated. We have nothing to export in terms of a revolution or a religion or a political system or values. We only want to do trade. We want to maintain the current international political order. If it still evolves in the right way, and we want to be peaceful with all the neighboring countries, with all the countries in the world, and we do not want to have war or conflict.
Yeah.
That's the similarity in China and Russians' political thinking right now.
Of course, very limited time left. But people would, yes, we agree with that. But you know, people who tend to look at things from a different perspective would say they don't think that the Chinese initiative or intention or Russian intention are 100% peaceful. You know, they would look at the military activities that the Russia is involved with, or the kind of ambitions that China is said to have. So, Professor Lukin, very briefly, what would you say to that? I mean, how do you look at the Russian wisdom, or do you look at it this way?
Well, I'm not sure about wisdom. I probably am not too wise to talk, wise enough to talk about wisdom. But I can talk about interests that we share, China and Russia. Well, China and Russia, ironically, became the main promoters of traditional values that the United States has always, and principles that the United States has always been promoted but now rejected. For example, free trade. It has always been the slogan of the West, but now President Trump openly rejects it. And like when you see WTO, China and Russia join WTO and support this system. The United States is attacking this system all the time.
Yeah.
The principle of the democracy in international relations, you know, that equal partnership and so on. So Russia and China are stable from the point of view of the real existing economic system, international economic system and international political system. Russia and China are stabilizing force.
All right.
I would say even conservative force, not a revisionist force.
We have to.
They want to stabilize. They want stability. The United States wants to undermine it. Okay.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests. Traditional Chinese saying going, when you're challenged, you know better, you come wiser. All right, many thanks to Professor Alexander Lukin joining us from Moscow, and Victor Gao here in the Beijing studio. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.